All right, let's start by looking at the aesthetic ideas of John Crowe Ransom. In an essay called Criticism as Pure Speculation, Ransom takes to tasks, indeed rejects, all psychological and moral approaches to literature in favor of a more objective, ontological approach. Again, even more than Richards, Ransom wants us to focus on the object and stop worrying. I mean, we shouldn't worry about intellect, but we shouldn't worry about emotions either. We shouldn't worry about moral qualities or anything. Don't worry about pragmatic concerns or mimetic concerns or expressive concerns. He really is trying to cut the poem off from all of these external concerns. Now let's look at how he criticizes. First of all, he criticizes psychological critics, and he calls Richards a psychological critic because of this idea that it fills our emotional needs and all that. He called him an emotional critic, and he accuses him of making too sharp a distinction between feeling-centered poetry and cold, unemotional science. Because what Ransom noticed, and I think he's probably right, is that this dichotomy between emotional and intellectual belief, finally, all it does is feed the positivistic critique of poetry as useless and all emotional and flowery. So, in other words, Richards ended up making the mistake he didn't want to make. Let me give you an analogy that's meaningful to me. Myself, as an evangelical Christian, I tend to have a pretty conservative view of the Bible as the Word of God. But I'm really bothered by ultra-conservative fundamentalist Christians who always want to talk about the Bible as if it were a scientific textbook. I think that those guys got it all wrong. I mean, I like the fact that they're trying to defend the Bible. But what they're doing is they're trying to defend the Bible as if it were a mathematical, logical text. And it's not. Mathematically, logically, scientifically speaking, there are contradictions in the Bible. But I at least feel emotionally, theologically, aesthetically, and all those other ways, it doesn't contradict itself. But I think the fundamentalists shoot themselves in the foot, like I.A. Richards does, when they try to treat it in the wrong way and try to play by the rules of science. And, by the way, again, a lot of these new critics were religious, and I think they understood what was happening to the Bible as well as what was happening to poetry. Now, let's see what Ransom offers as an answer to this. What Ransom says is that a poem is not just an expression of emotions, emotional belief. Rather, it is something that has a paraphrasable core that is as logical and coherent as any scientific statement. In other words, it's not all emotion. There is an intellectual core to the poem. He calls it the paraphrasable core because it's something you can paraphrase in a sort of scientific statement. So he believed that poetry isn't just about emotions. It has ideas. It has a core that is logical and coherent. But what makes it a poem, what distinguishes it as a poem, is that this core is situated in what he calls a context of lively, local details. A context that, scientifically speaking, is irrelevant. You see, in a scientific proof text, all you want is the facts and the figures, and that's it. You don't want to know all sorts of little trivial things that have nothing to do with the science that's going on. But in a poem, you want those lively local details. They are what make it concrete. And so for him, what a poem is, ontologically speaking, in other words, what the essence of a poem is that it's a fusion of this logical, paraphrasable core and these lively local details that embody and concretize it. That's what poetry is. All right, that's his attack on psychological critics. But Ransom also criticizes moral, Platonic-minded poets and critics who would judge a poem by its moral or philosophical or political message. He doesn't want people that go the other way, and all they care about is what he says is the paraphrasable core. I don't want somebody that always judges a poem only by what it says in a moral or scientific way. What the problem is that these critics are accepting the poem's paraphrasable core, but then they're treating that core as if it were equivalent to the poem, as if all the details were irrelevant and all that's important is the paraphrasable core. Well, if that's all that was important, then the poet wouldn't have written a poem. He would have written prose and just said what he meant. And so what he's saying is that when we try to find the message of the poem, and that's it, it's moral, what we're doing is killing the poem. We are ripping it out of what it is. We're not respecting its ontological status or essence. Echoing Arnold's distinction between uninterested and disinterested, Ransom asserts that poetry is not unethical, but post ethical. In other words, that's like saying it's not immoral, but amoral. In other words, poetry doesn't worry about ethical things. It is post-ethical. Not that it doesn't care, but it's beyond that. It transcends that. It is amoral. It is disinterested. It's dealing with something more than that. It is not simply theology or philosophy. It is something above that. It is aesthetic, again, in the Kantian sense. Well, in reaction against psychological and moral criticism, Ransom offers instead an objective, ontological, Kantian view of poetry. Now, if you're really listening carefully, you should be thinking, wait a minute, this guy's contradicting himself. How can you be ontological and Kantian? I thought Kant was an epistemologist. Well, you're right, it is a paradox. The new critics are ontological Kantians. They believe with Kant, but rather than... Okay, they accept with Kant that poetry or aestheticism is a free play. But what they do is take the free play out of the mind, out of the subjective epistemological approach of Kant, and put it back in the poetic object. So that's why they're Kantian ontologists. Once again, they accept the free play of mind that's central to Kant, but they locate that free play of mind not in the subjective mind, but in the poetic object. That's maybe the best way to explain how you can be an ontological Kantian. What he's saying is that a poem must be treated as a free and autonomous end in itself. It is an end in itself. And you know, a lot of you, when I was teaching Kant, a lot of you probably kept thinking, he's not talking about the mind, he's talking about the poem, isn't he? But remember, Kant and Burke said, no, I'm talking about the mind. Well, if that bothered you, you should like this, because now they are talking about the poem. The poem, the object, is an end in itself. The critic, therefore, must accept the poem as it is, with both its abstract universal message and its particular concrete details intact. We must accept the poem as it is. We must accept its ontological status. He explains this by adopting a rather homely metaphor of a house. And I think it's kind of interesting, but kind of silly maybe. But Ransom defines a poem as a logical structure having a local texture. Again, a logical structure having a local texture. In other words, like a house, it has a functional frame. That's the paraphrasable core. It's got a functional frame, but that frame, to come back to the house, is augmented by decorative paint, wallpaper, etc., etc. So if the frame of the house is the paraphrasable core, the wallpaper and all the stuff we add to the home, that's the lively local details. So that's what a poem is. Ontologically speaking, it is a fusion of that. Well, what does that mean? It means that critics who focus on structure to the exclusion of texture, all they care about is the frame, and they don't care about the details, well, they haven't really understood the poem, for they have ignored its ontological essence. If a poem is structure plus texture, core plus details, if you only look at the core, only look at the structure, then you're not respecting it as a poem. If you talk to me and you only respect me intellectually and forget about my emotional side, you haven't accepted me in my ontological essence. Or if you look only at my physical and ignore my spiritual, or vice versa, you're not treating me as what I am, a fusion of physical and spiritual, intellectual and emotional, and many different things that we as human beings are. Now, Ransom argues that Hegelian Platonic critics who claim to champion poetry as a concrete universal are really only interested in universals. And there is some truth to that. Hegel keeps saying concrete universal, but if you read Hegel, he keeps ending up in the abstract world. He can't stay in the physical world. He says he wants to, but he never does. Well, the new critics not only say they want to, but they do. They stay with the world. They don't lose the world. Ransom compares poems to cream-filled pastries and critics to epicures who not only relish the pastry shell, but each drop of cream. So poetry is something to feast on in all its physicality. Just eat it up. I love that. The true critic, in other words, is a hedonist who dines lavishly on a feast of poetry. A tasty, if radical, view of criticism that is captured in the title of Ransom's best-known critical work, The World's Body. The true critic, again, should feast on poetry in all of its physicality. Finally, I promised you a political connotation. Let me give that to you now. This essay was written in 1941, and it's important to know this date because it suggests a serious side to it. 1941, totalitarianism is taking over the world. Now, while the world around him is being enslaved by totalitarian regimes, both from the right and the left, finally, here is Ransom asserting boldly that a poem is a democratic state. And that's the language he uses. He says a poem is a democracy. It's a democratic state. And he's thinking politically now. Let me explain how this works. Unlike in fascist or Marxist states, totalitarianism, where citizens are assigned specific functions from which they cannot deviate, democratic states allow their citizens to define and express themselves freely. Let's think about it. If you live in a totalitarian state, you are regimented. The state tells you what you are going to be and what you're going to do, and you better fall in line for the greater good. That's what totalitarianism does, whether it's from the right or the left. We are just cogs in a wheel, and we must function. We must march to the orders. What about a democracy? In a democracy, if it works, we are allowed to define and express our own individuality. Without destroying the state, we can define ourselves and express ourselves freely. Let's link this now with poetry. In the same way, positivistic prose insists that each word have a fixed meaning and function, a one-to-one correspondence. And so prose, and especially positivistic prose, is like totalitarianism because every word has to have one meaning and nothing more. And every word has to be absolutely functional. It has to function in coordination with, again, the paraphrasable core. It must say, and it must say it clearly. In contrast, poetry allows each of its concrete details, what Ransom calls structure, to function freely and uniquely. You see, just as every individual in a democracy has his own voice, has his own individuality, in a true poem, Ransom says, each of those details, each of the texture, is able to exert its own individual pressure. It might even contradict the paraphrasable core in a strange way, or at least soften it or deflect it in different areas of meaning. Well, that is why a poem is like a democracy, because, again, there is freedom within the democracy, within the poem. So, again, I really think that there's a political aspect to this, and Ransom means there to be. Now, as a true critic respects the autonomy of the poem's texture, therefore, he will never try to subject that texture to a strict, regimented core of meaning. If you, as a critic, think that everything has got to fall in line with the paraphrasable core, and if it contradicts at all, it's got to be cut and thrown away, then you're like a dictator. You are a sort of Hitler critic, if you will. A poem is an autonomy, and it's got to be treated as such. You've got to treat it with respect. So I really think that, again, there is a mission here to the new critics. I think they're doing something important. They're speaking up for freedom in the way that Kant and Hegel and all of those Germans were speaking up for freedom, a freedom of expression, a freedom of self-determinism. And they found that in the aesthetic whole that is the microcosm of the poem. All right, in our next lecture, we will continue our discussion of new criticism by looking at two radical new critics, Wimsatt and Brooks.